Whisper Canyon earned its name from the screams. The bounty hunter Edmund Garrison's body swayed from a twisted juniper tree, his flesh stripped methodically, bones gleaming white under the Nevada sun like a macabre warning carved into the desert itself. This is the story of how 9 escaped slaves transformed a remote western canyon into their fortress of survival, where desperation crossed the final threshold of humanity, and hunger became judge, jury, and executioner. The canyon cuts through the Humboldt Range like a knife wound that refuses to heal. Even now, prospectors claim the ravine swallows voices, that whispers drift through its passages carrying words in languages no living person speaks. The creek runs red from iron deposits, trickling between sun-bleached stones that stand as silent witnesses to what happened in 1852, when 9 souls fleeing bondage discovered that freedom's price could be measured in more than blood alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The canyon sits carved into Nevada's Humboldt Range like a wound that time forgot to close. Whisper Canyon, the Paiute called it long before white settlers claimed these territories, before wagon trains carved ruts through alkali flats, before the Compromise of 1850 made this disputed land officially American. The indigenous people avoided this place, claiming the stone walls held voices of the dead, that the wind carried warnings in languages older than memory itself. The creek that trickles through the canyon's base runs rust-red from iron oxide leaching through volcanic rock. Local prospectors who braved the passage report unsettling phenomena: compasses spinning without reason, temperatures dropping 30 degrees within 100 yards, and sounds that seem to originate from the stone itself rather than any living source. The juniper and pinyon pine that cling to the canyon rim grow twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching away from the gorge as if repelled by something below. Before I tell you what 9 desperate souls did in that canyon during the winter of 1852, I need to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it in your part of the world? Drop a comment below and let me know your location. And if stories of survival pushed beyond all moral boundaries fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in territorial records and whispered around campfires for over 170 years, a tale so disturbing that even hardened frontier lawmen refuse to document the complete truth. The Blackwood Estate sprawled across 3,000 acres of cotton fields in eastern Tennessee, where the Holston River carved its path through valleys already ancient when the first Europeans arrived. Master Vincent Blackwood ruled his plantation with systematic cruelty, refined through 3 generations of his family's ownership of human beings. His father had taught him that fear maintained productivity, that mercy bred rebellion, and that enslaved workers were investments requiring firm management like livestock or farm equipment. Blackwood employed 2 overseers to enforce his vision of order. The first, a former sailor named Patrick Donovan, carried a braided leather whip that had seen service on 3 continents and bore stains that never fully washed clean. The second, a Tennessee mountain man called simply Garrison, tracked runaways with methodical efficiency, boasting he'd never lost a fugitive who made it past the county line. Garrison kept his payment simple: $20 per captured slave, plus whatever finder's fee he could extract from their terror during the return journey. 9 people worked the furthest tobacco fields, breaking new ground and clearing stumps from land Blackwood planned to plant that spring. They called themselves the Exodus 9, a name whispered only when overseers rode distant fence lines, a covenant spoken in the language of hope that somehow survived in places where hope should have died completely. William Brown led them, a carpenter whose hands could shape wood with precision that rivaled any craftsman in Nashville. His shoulders carried the scars of punishment for teaching others to read, crimes Blackwood considered more dangerous than simple laziness or theft. Alongside William worked Alexander Davis, who understood numbers and astronomy, who could navigate by stars that white men claimed only educated people could interpret. Samuel Thompson carved tools from scrap metal, transforming broken plow blades into implements that served purposes their makers never intended. Logan Robinson tracked weather patterns and animal behavior with accuracy that made him invaluable during planting season. Joshua Martin knew every plant that grew wild in Tennessee forests, Which routes could sustain life and which could end it with merciful speed? Andrew Harris built structures meant to last generations, his engineering instinct operating without benefit of formal education that society denied him. Jonathan Walker possessed a voice that made the hardest labor bearable, his songs carrying coded messages that overseers dismissed as simple field hollers. The two women among them served different but equally crucial roles. Emily Johnson worked in the main house, her position providing access to information that field hands never heard. Travel schedules, visitor arrivals, conversations about slave patrols and territorial politics. Olivia Smith tended the sick, her knowledge of healing passed down through generations of women who'd kept their people alive despite conditions designed to break bodies and spirits alike. The Exodus 9 whispered freedom during harvest season, planning escape routes through mountains that could hide armies. They'd studied territorial maps stolen from Blackwood's library, memorized landmarks described by previous runaways who'd been captured and returned, and gathered supplies with patience that measured time in seasons rather than days. Whisper Canyon offered the perfect destination, remote, difficult to access, and avoided even by experienced hunters who claimed the place felt wrong in ways they couldn't articulate. From the Journal of Margaret Blackwood, Vincent's wife, dated September 3, 1852, 9 of the field people vanished last night like smoke before wind. Vincent rages with fury I've never witnessed, even during the incident with the Nashville speculators. He's sworn to retrieve his property or see them dead as examples. I fear what methods he'll employ, though I dare not speak such concerns aloud. The escape happened during a new moon in early September, when darkness pressed thick enough to hide movement from even alert sentries. 9 shadows slipped past the quarters and vanished into wilderness that stretched west toward territories where slavery's legal status remained contested, where Mormon settlements and mining camps created pockets of potential refuge for those desperate enough to risk everything. By dawn, Vincent Blackwood discovered their absence and assembled his hunting party with military precision. He enlisted Garrison immediately, knowing the bounty hunter's reputation for retrieving runaways from impossible distances. 3 neighboring plantation owners joined the pursuit, each contributing men and resources to a search party that swelled to 15 armed riders within hours. They carried rope, chains, firearms, and iron determination to make examples of slaves who dared challenge the natural order that sustained their entire world. But the Exodus 9 had vanished like morning mist. The hunting party followed tracks westward through Tennessee forests, across the Cumberland Gap, through Kentucky mountains where previous fugitives had been cornered and captured. The trail led through 6 states and territories, across rivers and mountain passes, through weather that turned from autumn rain to early winter snow. 6 weeks after the escape, Garrison's party tracked them to Nevada territory, following information purchased from frightened travelers who'd glimpsed 9 black people moving through landscapes where their presence drew immediate attention. The bounty hunter pushed his group forward with professional focus, confident that cornering desperate fugitives in unfamiliar territory would end this pursuit before winter made travel impossible. They reached Whisper Canyon's entrance on October 20th, where tracks seemed to vanish into stone itself. The canyon mouth yawned 40 feet wide, its walls rising straight up like cathedral pillars, carved by forces that predated human presence in these lands. The rust-red creek gurgled between volcanic boulders, scattered like ancient offerings to gods no one remembered. Garrison's tracking dogs whined and refused to enter, their hackles raised against something that transcended scent or sound. The bounty hunter forced the party forward anyway, his pride wounded by fugitives who'd led him across half a continent. Vincent Blackwood rode beside him, his rifle ready for the moment he spotted his escaped property, already planning the punishments that would serve as lessons to his remaining workers. What the hunting party didn't know was that 9 desperate people had reached this canyon 3 days earlier, carrying supplies gathered across 6 states and knowledge accumulated through 2 months of desperate flight. They'd discovered caves that tunneled deep into volcanic rock, springs that provided water year-round, and evidence that previous inhabitants had abandoned this place suddenly, leaving behind tools and supplies as if fleeing from something that made starvation preferable to remaining. The Exodus 9 had prepared defensive positions using every skill their combined experience provided. William Brown had crafted weapons from materials scavenged during their flight. Alexander Davis had calculated sight lines and defensive angles with mathematical precision. The others had contributed according to their abilities, transforming a natural refuge into something that could be defended or, if necessary, used for purposes none of them wanted to contemplate, but all understood might become necessary. The hunting party pressed deeper into the gorge, following tracks that seemed deliberately placed to draw them forward. Garrison led with professional caution, but Vincent Blackwood's impatience pushed them faster than wisdom suggested. Behind them, the canyon walls rose higher, creating an amphitheater where sound behaved strangely, where echoes returned changed, where the very air seemed to press against exposed skin with weight that had nothing to do with altitude or temperature. They never saw the first trap until it closed. William Brown stood 6 feet tall despite a lifetime of inadequate nutrition, his frame built from labor that would have killed weaker men. At 43 years old, he'd survived longer than most enslaved people lived, his body bearing testament to 3 decades of systematic brutality. The scars across his back formed patterns that told stories. 15 lashes for teaching a young person to read, 20 for defending a woman from Donovan's whip, 30 for looking Vincent Blackwood directly in the eyes when questioned about a missing tool. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His hands, though calloused and scarred, retained the precision of a master craftsman. Before his enslavement, his father had been a free carpenter in North Carolina, who'd been kidnapped by slave catchers and sold south. William had learned woodworking before he understood the value of that knowledge, skills passed down during stolen moments when overseers looked elsewhere. He could join wood without nails, calculate load-bearing requirements by eye, and create structures that would outlast the people who commissioned them. Alexander Davis possessed a mind that frightened white men who encountered him. At 38 years old, he could calculate complex mathematics faster than educated men using paper and pencil, could read star positions like farmers read almanacs, and understood mechanical principles that eluded trained engineers. Blackwood had considered selling him multiple times, recognizing that intelligence in enslaved people represented danger to the entire system. But Alexander's value during planting season outweighed the risk, his ability to maximize crop yields making him too profitable to eliminate. He'd learned astronomy from an elderly enslaved man who'd been educated before the law changed to prohibit teaching literacy to black people. The old man had scratched star charts into dirt, explaining celestial navigation in whispers that had to be memorized immediately before evidence could be discovered. Alexander had absorbed this knowledge like parched earth absorbing rain, understanding that education represented the one form of property that couldn't be confiscated or sold away. Samuel Thompson's skill with metal came from necessity rather than training. At 35 years old, he'd spent 2 decades repairing broken tools, transforming scrap into functional implements, and creating solutions to problems that white overseers didn't bother solving. His hands bore burns from forge work performed without proper equipment, scars from metal that slipped while being shaped under inadequate conditions. He discovered that broken plow blades could become knife edges, that worn horseshoes could be reshaped into cutting tools, and that plantation blacksmith shops contained materials that could serve purposes their owners never imagined. Samuel worked slowly and carefully, his reputation for thoroughness providing cover for the extra time he spent creating items that never appeared in official inventories. Logan Robinson had been born on the Blackwood plantation 30 years earlier, his entire life spent within 20 miles of the main house. But those 20 miles contained forests, streams, fields, and weather patterns he'd studied with intensity that white naturalists would have envied. He could predict rain 3 days before it arrived, knew which animal behaviors signaled changing seasons, and understood the rhythms of nature that governed survival in wilderness. His tracking skills had made him valuable during hunting expeditions that provided meat for the plantation, occasions when he was permitted to carry weapons and move through forests with relative freedom. These brief liberations had taught him how to move silently, how to read signs that others missed, and how to anticipate the behavior of both animals and men who pursued them. Joshua Martin's knowledge of plants came from his grandmother, who'd been brought from West Africa as a young woman carrying seeds sewn into her clothing and knowledge embedded in memory. She'd taught him which roots could sustain life when food became scarce, which leaves could treat infection, which bark could ease pain, and which combinations could stop a human heart so gently that death seemed like falling asleep. At 28 years old, Joshua had become the unofficial physician for enslaved workers, treating injuries and illnesses that white doctors wouldn't bother addressing. His success rate exceeded that of trained medical practitioners, though his methods relied on botanical knowledge that scientific medicine dismissed as primitive superstition. He knew better, had seen his remedies save lives that conventional treatment would have abandoned. Andrew Harris built things that lasted forever. At 40 years old, he'd constructed barns, houses, fences, and bridges throughout the county, his work so solid that white craftsmen studied his techniques, while simultaneously denying that an enslaved person could possess genuine skill. His understanding of engineering principles operated purely through intuition and observation, yet his structures withstood storms and time better than those designed by educated architects. He'd learned by watching buildings fail, by studying which joints held and which separated under stress, by understanding how wood moved with temperature and humidity. This knowledge had taught him not just how to build, but how to dismantle, how to identify weaknesses in structures that appeared solid, and how to create failures that would seem accidental to observers who didn't understand the principles involved. Jonathan Walker's voice carried power that transcended simple melody. At 33 years old, he'd sung through decades of labor, his work songs serving multiple purposes that overseers never fully understood. The rhythms coordinated group efforts, making heavy lifting more efficient. The lyrics carried coded messages about overseer locations, upcoming punishments, or opportunities for brief rest. The melodies preserved African musical traditions that predated slavery, maintaining cultural connections that the system tried to erase. His songs could make hours pass faster, could ease pain through distraction, could communicate warnings without speaking words that might be overheard. White people heard simple field hollers, primitive music from primitive people, but enslaved communities heard news, history, resistance, and hope encoded in phrases that sounded innocent to those who didn't know the language. Emily Johnson worked in the main house, her position providing access to information that could mean the difference between successful escape and recapture. At 26 years old, she'd spent 8 years serving the Blackwood family, invisible in the way that domestic servants became to white people, who discussed sensitive matters, as if enslaved people couldn't hear or understand. She'd learned plantation schedules, visitor patterns, and conversation topics that white people assumed remained confidential. When Vincent Blackwood discussed business with neighboring plantation owners, Emily served refreshments and absorbed information about slave patrols, reward amounts, and tracking methods. When Margaret Blackwood corresponded with relatives, Emily delivered letters and memorized names and locations that might prove useful. Her intelligence network operated silently, gathering fragments of information that combined into actionable knowledge. Olivia Smith had delivered over 50 babies during her 31 years, had treated countless injuries and illnesses, and had eased the deaths of those beyond saving. Her healing knowledge combined African traditions with techniques learned from watching plantation doctors, creating hybrid medicine that proved more effective than either approach alone. She understood which treatments worked through pharmacological principles and which operated through psychological comfort that proved equally valuable. But Olivia also understood death. She knew which injuries would prove fatal despite treatment, which illnesses couldn't be cured with available resources, and which suffering could only be ended through mercy that society condemned but circumstances sometimes required. This knowledge had taught her that healing and harm existed on a continuum, that the same plants could save or kill depending on dosage and application, and that survival sometimes demanded choices no one should have to make. From the testimony of Jacob Mills, a slave catcher who refused to join the Whisper Canyon pursuit, recorded November 1852, "I tracked runaways for 12 years and never saw preparation like theirs. Most fugitives run with nothing but hope and desperation. These 9 had planned for months, maybe years. They'd studied maps, gathered supplies, and practiced skills they'd need. When Garrison showed me their trail, I told him he was chasing people who'd transformed from slaves into something else entirely. He laughed. I wonder if he died laughing." The Exodus 9 had spent 18 months preparing their escape, using every moment when overseers looked elsewhere to gather supplies, practice skills, and coordinate timing. William Brown had crafted tools disguised as broken implements, hiding functional items among plantation junk that no one bothered inventorying. Alexander Davis had memorized routes using star charts and maps glimpsed in Blackwood's library, committing entire territories to memory during brief moments when he delivered firewood to the main house. Samuel Thompson had created weapons from materials so common that their absence went unnoticed. Broken hinge pins became knife blades. Worn chain links became cutting edges. Discarded horseshoes became tools that could serve purposes ranging from excavation to combat. Logan Robinson had studied animal behavior that would help them survive in wilderness, learning which species could be hunted safely and which represented danger to inexperienced travelers. Joshua Martin had gathered seeds and root cuttings from medicinal plants, creating a portable pharmacy that could treat injuries and illnesses during extended flight. Andrew Harris had studied structural weaknesses in plantation buildings, understanding how fires could be set to appear accidental, how supports could be sabotaged to collapse during specific weather conditions, and how small acts of destruction could be disguised as natural decay. Jonathan Walker had composed songs that encoded escape plans, lyrics that seemed innocent but contained specific information about timing, routes, and contingencies. Emily Johnson had gathered intelligence about patrol schedules, reward amounts, and tracking methods that slave catchers employed. Olivia Smith had prepared supplies for treating injuries, knowing that their flight would likely involve violence that required immediate medical response. Their escape had been timed to coincide with harvest season, when white attention focused on getting crops to market before weather turned. They'd used techniques learned from previous runaways, moving at night, traveling through water when possible, and splitting up to create multiple trails that confused tracking dogs. Their route had been planned to avoid known patrol areas while taking advantage of sympathetic way stations that existed despite legal prohibition. 6 weeks of flight had tested every skill they possessed and revealed capabilities they hadn't known they carried. They'd crossed rivers, climbed mountains, evaded patrols, and survived on foraged food when cached supplies ran low. Each day brought them closer to territories where slavery's legal status remained contested, where Mormon settlements sometimes offered refuge, and where mining camps cared more about labor than legal ownership. Whisper Canyon had appeared in Alexander Davis's research as a remote location avoided by indigenous peoples and white settlers alike, a place whose reputation for supernatural phenomena might provide protection that physical barriers couldn't offer. When they'd finally reached the canyon 3 days before Garrison's party arrived, they'd discovered why previous inhabitants had abandoned this place suddenly. The caves extended deeper than natural geology suggested, the passages carved with precision that seemed deliberate, rather than the random erosion that shaped most limestone formations. Previous occupants had left behind supplies, tools, and disturbing evidence that they'd departed in haste, leaving behind valuable items that suggested fear outweighed material concerns. The walls bore markings that none of the Exodus 9 could interpret, symbols that seemed to shift in firelight and created unease that none of them wanted to acknowledge. But they had no choice except to defend this position. Behind them lay 6 weeks of desperate flight. Ahead lay only more wilderness and winter that would kill the unprepared. Garrison's hunting party represented the immediate threat, but Vincent Blackwood represented the systematic brutality that had defined their entire lives. The choice wasn't between fight and flight anymore, but between resistance and return to bondage that offered only slow death through labor and punishment. The Exodus 9 had prepared defensive positions using every skill their combined experience provided. Now they waited in the canyon's depths, listening to the hunting party approach, knowing that what happened in the next hours would determine whether they died as fugitives or transformed into something that society had no name for. Enslaved people who'd claimed the right to defend their freedom through whatever means survival required. The trap closed at noon on October 20, 1852, when autumn's sun reached its zenith and shadows shortened to nothing in Whisper Canyon's depths. Garrison's hunting party had pressed 300 yards into the gorge, following tracks that seemed too obvious, too deliberately placed. The bounty hunter recognized the signs of careful preparation, but Vincent Blackwood's impatience overruled caution. 15 mounted men carrying weapons and chains rode confidently toward what they assumed would be a simple capture of cornered fugitives. The first stone fell from the canyon rim without warning, a boulder weighing perhaps 300 pounds that crashed into the trail 20 feet ahead of the lead riders. Horses screamed and reared, throwing 2 men into the rust-red creek. Before the riders could recover, a second boulder fell, then a third, systematically blocking the trail in both directions. Within 30 seconds, the hunting party found themselves trapped in a 100-yard stretch of canyon floor, with sheer walls rising 40 feet on both sides. Andrew Harris had spent 2 days preparing this ambush, identifying stones that could be dislodged with properly placed levers, calculating trajectories that would create barriers rather than casualties. The engineering was precise. Block escape routes without killing the horses they might need later. Trap the hunters where superior numbers became disadvantage rather than strength. Create panic that would make trained men behave like frightened animals. 9 figures appeared on the canyon rims, positioned at intervals that provided overlapping fields of fire. William Brown stood with a crossbow crafted from scavenged wood and metal, its draw weight sufficient to penetrate leather at 50 yards. Alexander Davis held a similar weapon, his mathematical mind having calculated optimal angles for maximum accuracy. Samuel Thompson carried spears, tipped with sharpened metal that gleamed in afternoon sunlight. Logan Robinson positioned himself where he could monitor all approaches, his bow strung with arrows fletched from turkey feathers and tipped with points forged in secret fires. Joshua Martin stood ready with supplies that could treat wounds, or, if necessary, create them through botanical applications that worked faster than steel. Jonathan Walker's voice suddenly filled the canyon, a work song transformed into something primal that seemed to make the stone walls resonate with frequencies that bypassed ears and vibrated directly in chest cavities. Emily Johnson and Olivia Smith occupied positions that provided oversight of the entire ambush, their roles shifting from intelligence and healing to tactical coordination that utilized skills white society never acknowledged they possessed. Emily held throwing knives acquired during their flight, balanced weapons that could be deployed with accuracy that years of kitchen work had inadvertently trained. Olivia carried supplies that ranged from bandages to poisons, understanding that survival might require both healing and harm. From the official report of Deputy Marshal Thomas Crawford, who investigated the scene 2 weeks later, the ambush demonstrated planning and tactical knowledge that challenges assumptions about the intellectual capacity of Negro fugitives. The positioning suggested military training or natural strategic ability that conventional wisdom claims this race cannot possess. Evidence indicates they could have killed the entire party but chose capture over slaughter, suggesting moral restraint despite their desperate circumstances. Garrison recovered first from the initial shock, years of professional experience overriding the panic that paralyzed less seasoned hunters. He raised his rifle toward William Brown's position, but an arrow from Logan Robinson's bow struck the weapon's stock, splintering wood and sending the firearm spinning from the bounty hunter's hands. A second arrow embedded itself in the pommel of Garrison's saddle, close enough to his leg that the message was unmistakable. The next shot would draw blood. "Throw down your weapons," William Brown's voice carried across the canyon with authority that decades of submission had never fully suppressed. "Do it now, or the next volley won't be warnings." 3 of Blackwood's neighbors complied immediately, men whose commitment to retrieving fugitive slaves didn't extend to dying in a Nevada canyon. They dropped rifles and pistols, raising hands in surrender that represented pragmatism rather than cowardice. 4 others hesitated, looking to Vincent Blackwood for guidance their master couldn't provide while his own hands trembled on reins slick with nervous sweat. Garrison made his choice by reaching for a backup pistol concealed in his belt. Samuel Thompson's spear took him through the shoulder before the weapon cleared leather, spinning the bounty hunter from his saddle into shallow creek water that immediately began running darker than iron oxide alone could explain. The impact of his body sent ripples across the rust-red surface, creating patterns that seemed to move with intention rather than physics. "Anyone else want to test whether we're bluffing?" Alexander Davis's question carried the measured tone of someone stating mathematical proofs rather than making threats. His crossbow remained trained on Vincent Blackwood, the bolt's trajectory calculated to strike center mass if the trigger mechanism released. The remaining holdouts dropped their weapons, metal clattering against volcanic stone with sounds that echoed longer than acoustics suggested possible. Garrison thrashed in the creek, his wounded shoulder painting water with arterial spray that attracted attention from carrion birds that shouldn't have arrived so quickly. Olivia Smith descended from her position using handholds that Andrew Harris had carved into seemingly smooth rock, reaching the wounded bounty hunter with efficiency that suggested practice at emergency response. She examined the shoulder wound with professional detachment, her healing knowledge immediately recognizing that the spear had avoided major vessels despite massive trauma. Samuel Thompson had aimed with precision that allowed survival while ensuring incapacitation. Olivia packed the wound with moss treated with herbs that would prevent infection, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, while Garrison stared at her with confusion that transcended pain. "You're treating me?" The bounty hunter's voice carried genuine bewilderment. "After I've spent 6 weeks tracking you?" "I'm a healer," Olivia replied quietly, wrapping cloth torn from her own garments around the improvised bandage. "That doesn't change based on whether you deserve healing. But it also doesn't mean you're forgiven, or that consequences won't follow." William Brown and the others descended from their positions, weapons ready but postures suggesting confidence rather than desperation. They'd transformed from hunted fugitives into captors with authority over men who'd pursued them across 6 states. The psychological reversal represented more than tactical victory. It challenged fundamental assumptions about power relationships that the entire social system depended upon. Vincent Blackwood sat frozen on his horse, hands raised but eyes calculating odds for escape that didn't exist. His face had cycled through emotions ranging from rage to fear, to something approaching comprehension that his property had become predators, that his authority had evaporated like morning dew under Nevada's sun. The 15 men he'd led into this canyon now stood disarmed and surrounded, their superior numbers meaningless in terrain where the Exodus 9 held every advantage. "Get down off that horse," William Brown directed his former owner, his tone carrying none of the deference that decades of enslavement had conditioned. Slowly. "Keep your hands visible." Blackwood complied with movements that seemed to age him 10 years and 10 seconds. His boots touched canyon floor for the first time since entering the gorge, returning him to earth in ways both literal and metaphorical. The other hunters dismounted similarly, their postures suggesting men confronting realities that contradicted everything their culture had taught them about racial hierarchies and natural order. Andrew Harris and Logan Robinson moved among the captured horses, checking supplies and weapons with efficiency that suggested inventory rather than looting. They gathered firearms, ammunition, rope, chains, food supplies, and items that would prove useful for people trying to survive winter in remote wilderness. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Tools intended to return human beings to bondage would instead sustain their freedom. Jonathan Walker's singing shifted into melodies that carried triumph rather than mere survival. Work songs transformed into victory anthems that celebrated resistance rather than endurance. His voice filled the canyon with African rhythms that predated slavery, connecting this moment to ancestral traditions that the system had tried to erase but never fully destroyed. Emily Johnson examined papers found in Vincent Blackwood's saddlebags, property deeds, financial records, correspondence that documented the economic machinery of slavery with bureaucratic precision. She studied these documents with literacy that her former owner had tried to prevent, understanding for the first time the full scope of resources that had been deployed to recapture 9 people whose monetary value barely exceeded the cost of pursuing them. "You spent more tracking us than we're worth on any market," Emily observed, holding the expense ledgers where Blackwood could see his own accounting. This was never about economics. This was about making examples, about maintaining fear. Blackwood said nothing, but his silence confirmed what everyone present already understood. The pursuit had transcended simple property recovery to become ideological warfare, a demonstration that enslaved people who fled would be hunted regardless of cost, because the alternative threatened the entire system's stability. Joshua Martin moved among the captured men, assessing their physical condition with clinical detachment. Most appeared healthy, despite 6 weeks of travel, their supplies and resources having sustained them comfortably, while the Exodus 9 survived on foraged food and cached provisions. The contrast illustrated the profound inequalities that governed every aspect of their respective journeys. Alexander Davis studied the hunting party's tracking methods, examining their maps and notes with interest that transcended immediate circumstances. He memorized routes they'd followed, supply points they'd utilized, and communication networks they'd accessed. This intelligence would prove valuable if the Exodus 9 needed to continue their flight, though increasingly it appeared that flight alone wouldn't solve their fundamental problem. Samuel Thompson cleaned his spear in creek water that ran red from multiple sources now, the weapon's blade reflecting sunlight in ways that suggested sharpness beyond simple function. He'd designed this implement for specific purposes, calculating that non-lethal incapacitation would serve their interests better than killing that would escalate responses from authorities who might otherwise accept their disappearance. The sun began its afternoon descent, shadows lengthening across canyon walls that seemed to lean inward as if interested in what would happen next. The temperature dropped noticeably, Nevada's desert climate demonstrating the dramatic temperature swings that made survival challenging for people without adequate shelter or supplies. William Brown gathered the Exodus 9 for whispered consultation, their discussion conducted in voices too low for captured hunters to overhear. Decisions needed to be made about what to do with 15 men who knew their location, who represented ongoing threats as long as they remained alive and capable of reporting back to authorities. The options ranged from releasing them with warnings to permanent solutions that none of the Exodus 9 wanted to contemplate but circumstances might require. They'd crossed one moral boundary by attacking their pursuers. The question now involved how many more lines they were willing to cross in service of survival and freedom. Garrison lay in shallow water, his fever rising despite Olivia's treatment, his body fighting infection that herbs could slow but not prevent entirely. The bounty hunter who'd boasted of never losing a fugitive now faced the possibility of dying in a Nevada canyon, killed by people he'd dismissed as primitive and helpless. The irony wasn't lost on him, though whether he felt remorse or simply recognized tactical miscalculation remained unclear. Vincent Blackwood watched his former property discuss his fate, the master who'd owned human beings now experiencing the terror of complete powerlessness. His calculations shifted visibly across features that had never before confronted the possibility that enslaved people might claim authority over their own existence and over those who'd claimed to own them. The canyon walls caught the last direct sunlight, volcanic rock glowing briefly before shadows consumed them entirely. Night would bring cold that could kill the unprepared, raising urgent questions about shelter, supplies, and what the Exodus 9 intended to do with captives who represented both immediate threats and potential resources. What none of them knew yet was that Whisper Canyon held secrets beyond strategic location, that previous inhabitants had abandoned this place for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience or preference, and that the coming winter would test every assumption they'd made about survival, morality, and the prices human beings could pay while still claiming humanity. The decision came as darkness settled over Whisper Canyon like a shroud woven from cold air and uncertainty. William Brown stood apart from the group, studying 15 captured men whose fates rested in hands that had never been permitted to hold power over white lives. The weight of that responsibility pressed against his chest with physical force, making breath come harder than the thin air alone could explain. "We can't let them go," Alexander Davis stated with mathematical certainty during their whispered council. "They'll ride straight to the nearest settlement and return with military forces we can't resist. Garrison alone represents a threat, but Blackwood carries social capital that will mobilize resources beyond anything we've faced." "We can't kill 15 men in cold blood," Olivia Smith countered, her healer's instinct recoiling from the implications. "That transforms us from fugitives seeking freedom into murderers. It gives them justification for everything they've claimed about our nature. Proves their propaganda about savage tendencies requiring civilized control." Samuel Thompson sharpened his spear against volcanic rock, the rasping sound providing counterpoint to their discussion. "They already believe we're savage. Nothing we do will change minds that were made up before we were born. The question isn't about their opinions but our survival and whether we're willing to pay the prices that freedom demands." Logan Robinson had been monitoring the canyon approaches, his attention split between their captives and potential reinforcements that might follow if the hunting party's absence triggered searches. "Weather's turning," he reported quietly. "Snow coming within 3 days, maybe sooner. Winter storms in these mountains kill people with resources and preparation. These men have neither, if we strip their supplies." "That's not the same as killing them directly," Emily Johnson observed, though her tone suggested she recognized the distinction was philosophical rather than practical. "If we take their horses, weapons, and supplies, then release them on foot in territory they don't know with winter approaching, we're just letting nature do what we won't." Joshua Martin had been studying the captured men with clinical attention, noting their physical conditions and psychological states. Half of them are already showing signs of exposure and exhaustion. The others won't last a week without shelter and food. If we're going to release them, we need to do it now. while they still have strength to reach settlements before storms arrive. Andrew Harris examined the canyon's defensive positions, calculating improvements they could make if they intended to remain through winter. This place offers advantages, but defending it against military forces requires more than good positions. We'd need supplies we don't have, weapons beyond what we've crafted, and numbers that could sustain casualties while maintaining effective resistance. Jonathan Walker's singing had quieted during their deliberations, his voice reserved for moments when communication required the coded language that only they understood. But his silence spoke volumes about the weight of decisions that transcended simple tactics to touch questions about who they were becoming, and whether survival justified transformations that might destroy the humanity they were fighting to claim. Vincent Blackwood sat among his former slaves, captives, hands bound with rope that Andrew Harris had tied using knots that wouldn't loosen regardless of struggle. The master who'd owned human beings now experienced bondage firsthand, though the duration measured hours rather than lifetimes. His face had settled into an expression that suggested calculations continuing despite circumstances, plotting moves on a chessboard where he no longer controlled any pieces. "You think you've won something," Blackwood spoke suddenly, his voice carrying across the canyon with aristocratic authority that hadn't fully abandoned him despite reverse circumstances. "You think capturing us changes the fundamental nature of your situation, but you're still fugitives in territory that offers no legal protection, still property under laws that every court will uphold, still subject to recapture or death by anyone who encounters you." William Brown approached his former owner with deliberate steps that demonstrated control rather than aggression. "We know exactly what we are under your laws. The question you should be asking is what you are under ours, here in this canyon where your legal authority doesn't reach, where the only law that matters is what 9 free people decide to enforce." "Free?" Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You're not free. You're fugitives living on borrowed time, counting days until winter kills you or authorities find you. Freedom requires more than simply running away. It requires society's recognition, legal protection, economic sustainability. You have none of those things and never will." "Maybe," Alexander Davis interjected calmly, "or maybe freedom is simpler than you claim. Maybe it's just the ability to make choices about our own lives, to defend ourselves against those who would harm us, to determine our own fates rather than accepting the ones you assigned. By that measure, we're freer right now than we've ever been, despite every disadvantage you've described." The philosophical debate was interrupted by urgent movement from Logan Robinson, who detected sounds that didn't match wind or wildlife. "Riders approaching from the east," he reported quietly. "At least 6 horses moving carefully like they're tracking or searching." The Exodus 9 moved with practiced coordination that months of preparation and weeks of flight had refined into instinctive teamwork. They repositioned to defensive locations while Emily Johnson gagged the captives to prevent them from calling out warnings. The approaching riders represented either reinforcements for the hunting party or coincidental travelers, whose timing created complications neither group could afford. Alexander Davis studied the canyon's acoustics, calculating how sound would travel and where the approaching riders would first become visible. If they're looking for Blackwood's party, they'll find the blocked trail and know something happened. If they're just passing through, they might turn back when they see the obstacles. The riders appeared at the canyon entrance as twilight faded into full darkness, 6 mounted men carrying torches that created dancing shadows against volcanic walls. Their leader studied the boulder-blocked trail with obvious suspicion, his posture suggesting military or law enforcement experience rather than casual travel. "Blackwood," the leader called out, his voice echoing off stone surfaces. "Vincent Blackwood, if you're in there, make yourself known. We received your telegraph about pursuing fugitives and came to provide assistance." The Exodus 9 exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. Blackwood had sent messages before entering the canyon, ensuring that reinforcements would follow if his party didn't return on schedule. The precaution demonstrated strategic thinking that transformed their tactical victory into a temporary advantage that was already eroding. William Brown made calculations that measured survival against morality, immediate safety against long-term consequences. The approaching riders represented threats that couldn't be captured or controlled, using methods that had worked against Blackwood's party. These men were alert, armed and positioned where the Exodus 9's ambush tactics couldn't be replicated. "We need to move," William decided quietly. "Gather what supplies we can carry, prepare the horses, and use the northern passages that Andrew mapped yesterday. We can't defend this position against continuous reinforcements, and staying means eventual siege that we'll lose through attrition." "What about them?" Samuel Thompson gestured toward the captives, 15 men whose fates still hung undecided. The question hung in cold air that was growing colder as night deepened. The approaching riders would find their companions regardless of what the Exodus 9 decided, but the condition in which they found them would determine how aggressively the pursuit continued and what resources authorities would deploy. Olivia Smith moved among the captives, checking Garrison's wound and assessing the others. Conditions with professional detachment. They'll survive if they're found within the next few hours. After that, exposure and Garrison's infection will start claiming lives. "Then we leave them," William decided. "Bound but alive, with enough slack in the ropes that they can work free eventually. We take their horses, weapons, and supplies, but we don't take their lives. Let them explain to those riders how 9 unarmed fugitives captured 15 armed hunters." The decision made, the Exodus 9 moved with efficiency born from necessity. They stripped the captives of anything useful while leaving enough clothing to survive the night. They gathered firearms, ammunition, food supplies, blankets, and tools that would sustain them through winter months. They prepared the horses for rapid travel through terrain that would challenge even experienced riders in darkness. Vincent Blackwood watched these preparations with eyes that held something beyond simple rage or fear. "You're making a mistake," he said once his gag was briefly removed for water. "Leaving us alive means we'll testify about what happened here, provide descriptions that will make your capture inevitable, ensure that consequences extend beyond simple return to bondage." "Maybe," William replied, securing the gag again with gentleness that seemed almost cruel in its humanity. "Or maybe leaving you alive demonstrates that we're not the monsters you've claimed we are, that we can show mercy even when you never did, that we're capable of moral choices that your system denies we can make. Either way, you'll survive to tell whatever story serves your purposes, and we'll survive to make our own choices about the future." The northern passages that Andrew Harris had explored led deeper into the canyon system, following routes that seemed too regular to be entirely natural. The walls bore markings similar to those in the main caves, symbols that none of them could interpret, but that suggested previous inhabitants had modified these passages for purposes that remained unclear. As they led 15 horses through narrow defiles lit only by moonlight filtering through gaps in overhead rock, Jonathan Walker began singing again. His voice carried melodies that seemed older than the stone surrounding them, rhythms that connected this moment to ancestral memories of flight and resistance that predated American slavery entirely. Behind them, the 6 riders would find their companions bound and stripped of supplies. They'd hear stories about sophisticated ambushes and tactical abilities that challenged assumptions about fugitive slaves' capabilities. They'd see evidence of planning and execution that suggested intelligence and organization beyond what conventional wisdom claimed this race could demonstrate. The pursuit would continue, perhaps with greater resources and determination, but the Exodus 9 had demonstrated something more valuable than temporary tactical victory. They'd proven to themselves and others that enslaved people could think strategically, act decisively, and show mercy even when circumstances justified violence. Whether that proof would ultimately serve their survival remained uncertain, but it had transformed them from property into agents of their own fates. The canyon passages wound deeper into mountain darkness, leading toward destinations that none of them could predict, but all of them had chosen freely. Behind them lay bondage and everything familiar. Ahead lay only uncertainty, and winter and freedom's cold promise that survival might be possible if they remained willing to pay prices no one should have to calculate. The northern passages opened into a cavern system that defied natural explanation. The main chamber stretched 200 feet across, its ceiling lost in darkness beyond the reach of firelight. Limestone formations descended like frozen waterfalls, their surfaces bearing carvings that suggested deliberate artistry rather than random erosion. The temperature remained constant regardless of outside conditions, neither the desert's daytime heat nor nighttime cold penetrating stone walls that seemed to regulate their own climate. Andrew Harris studied the architecture with fascination that temporarily displaced survival concerns. This wasn't formed by water alone. he observed, running his hands across walls that bore tool marks too regular to be accidental. Someone carved these passages, expanded natural caves into something larger. The question is who and why they abandoned work that must have taken decades. Alexander Davis examined the carvings with similar interest, recognizing patterns that suggested astronomical knowledge. These symbols track celestial movements, marking solstices and equinoxes with precision that requires long-term observation. Whoever created this place understood mathematics and engineering at levels that rival anything in contemporary civilization. The Exodus 9 established their camp in the main chamber, using supplies taken from Blackwood's hunting party to create a temporary refuge that could sustain them through the approaching winter. William Brown organized defensive positions, while Logan Robinson scouted passages that might provide escape routes or tactical advantages if pursuers located their position. Emily Johnson inventoried their resources with accountant precision, calculating that food supplies would last approximately 8 weeks if carefully rationed. Water flowed from an underground spring, whose source remained unknown despite Andrew's explorations. Fuel for fires existed in deadwood that previous inhabitants had cached throughout the cave system, dried timber that burned with minimal smoke. Olivia Smith established a medical station using supplies from her own gathering and items taken from the captured hunting party. She treated minor injuries sustained during their flight and ambush, her healing knowledge proving essential for maintaining health in conditions that would challenge even robust constitutions. Joshua Martin explored the cavern's botanical resources, discovering fungi growing in specific chambers where moisture and darkness created ideal conditions. Some species he recognized as edible supplements to their rations. Others possessed medicinal properties useful for treating infections or managing pain. A few varieties he'd never encountered before. Mushrooms that grew in patterns suggesting cultivation rather than natural occurrence. Someone farmed these. Joshua reported after 3 days of investigation. These growth patterns don't happen randomly. Previous inhabitants understood fungiculture, knew which species thrived in specific conditions, and managed cultivation cycles that continued even after they left. The discovery raised questions about the cavern's previous occupants and why they'd abandoned such a sophisticated refuge. The Exodus 9 found additional evidence during their explorations. Pottery fragments bearing designs that matched no known indigenous traditions. Metal tools crafted from alloys that shouldn't exist in primitive mining operations, and preserved food supplies stored in sealed chambers that remained edible despite obvious age. Samuel Thompson examined the metal implements with professional interest, recognizing techniques that paralleled his own forge work but demonstrated knowledge beyond what he'd taught himself through trial and error. Whoever made these understood metallurgy at levels that require sustained practice and knowledge transfer across generations. These aren't survival tools crafted by desperate fugitives. This was an established community with specialized skills and long-term planning. Winter arrived with the sudden ferocity characteristic of Nevada mountains, transforming the landscape above their refuge into a frozen wasteland where survival required resources and knowledge beyond what most travelers possessed. Snow accumulated to depths that made passage impossible, wind-carved drifts that could bury horses and riders within hours, and temperatures dropped to levels that killed exposed flesh in minutes. The Exodus 9 remained secure in their underground sanctuary, protected by stone walls and geothermal heat that kept their chambers comfortable despite surface conditions. But their isolation brought challenges beyond simple survival, creating tensions that months of shared purpose had temporarily suspended. Vincent Blackwood's words echoed in William Brown's memory during long nights when sleep came reluctantly despite physical exhaustion. The plantation owner had been correct about one essential point. Capturing their pursuers hadn't changed their fundamental situation. They remained fugitives without legal protection, property under laws that every court would uphold, subjects of a social system that commanded resources far beyond what 9 individuals could resist. The philosophical weight of that reality pressed against William's consciousness like the stone ceiling pressed against structural supports. They'd won tactical victories but remained strategically vulnerable, their freedom measured in borrowed time rather than permanent achievement. The approaching spring would bring renewed pursuit, perhaps with military forces that could overwhelm defensive positions that had proved effective against simple hunting parties. Alexander Davis spent his isolation studying the astronomical carvings, seeking patterns that might reveal the previous inhabitants' fate or provide insights applicable to their own situation. His mathematical mind found comfort in celestial mechanics that operated according to laws immune to human prejudice or social constructs. Stars moved in predictable orbits regardless of who observed them. Planetary motions followed equations that didn't require legislative approval. But even mathematics offered limited comfort when applied to their practical circumstances. Alexander calculated that their supplies would sustain them until late February, leaving a 6-week gap before spring conditions would permit travel or foraging. The shortfall represented a problem that arithmetic could identify but not solve, an equation whose solution required resources they didn't possess. Logan Robinson hunted in the cavern passages, discovering blind fish in underground streams and small mammals that had adapted to permanent darkness. His tracking skills translated surprisingly well to subterranean environments, reading signs in dust patterns and interpreting sounds that echoed through stone corridors with complexity that surface acoustics never matched. But hunting provided only supplemental nutrition, and Logan recognized that their food situation would become critical long before spring arrived. The previous inhabitants' cached supplies helped extend their timeline, yet even those resources showed signs of depletion that suggested previous occupants had faced similar calculations and reached conclusions that ended in abandonment. Samuel Thompson maintained their weapons and tools, his forge work limited to repairs rather than creation since proper metalworking required ventilation systems they couldn't establish underground. He studied the advanced implements left by previous inhabitants, learning techniques through reverse engineering that expanded his understanding of metallurgical principles. During quiet moments, Samuel wondered about the people who'd created these sophisticated tools and why they'd left them behind. The metal quality suggested access to ores and refining methods beyond what primitive mining would provide. The craftsmanship demonstrated skill levels that required years of practice. Yet the makers had abandoned their work suddenly enough to leave valuable items scattered throughout the cave system. Joshua Martin's botanical explorations revealed increasingly concerning patterns in the cultivated fungi. Several species demonstrated growth rates that exceeded natural reproduction cycles, expanding across chamber walls with speed that suggested external stimulation. Other varieties exhibited color changes that his grandmother's teaching claimed indicated environmental stress or nutrient depletion. Most troubling were specimens growing in the deepest chambers, mushrooms that pulsed with bioluminescence following rhythms that seemed to correspond with the astronomical carvings Alexander studied. Joshua's botanical knowledge couldn't explain these phenomena, though his instincts warned that rapid growth and unusual luminescence often indicated toxicity or environmental imbalance. Andrew Harris continued mapping the cave system, discovering passages that extended far beyond their initial explorations. Some tunnels descended to depths where air grew thin and temperatures rose uncomfortably. Others climbed toward the surface through routes so narrow that only determined individuals could navigate them. A few passages terminated at walls that appeared natural, until careful examination revealed concealed doors or barriers created with engineering skill that matched the main chamber's construction. Behind one such barrier, Andrew discovered a chamber that had been deliberately sealed. The room contained preserved remains of perhaps 20 individuals, their bodies arranged with ceremonial precision that suggested intentional burial rather than disaster or disease. Pottery and metal items surrounded the deceased grave goods that indicated respect and reverence rather than hasty disposal. The discovery troubled Andrew deeply, raising questions about what had killed these people and why survivors had sealed their burial chamber before abandoning the entire complex. Disease seemed the most logical explanation, yet the preservation quality suggested something more immediate and catastrophic had ended lives too quickly for proper individual burials. Jonathan Walker's singing took on qualities that reflected their isolation and growing concerns about the future. His work songs transformed into melodies that carried melancholy notes, rhythms that spoke of uncertainty rather than triumph. The cave acoustics amplified his voice in ways that created harmonics beyond what single human vocal cords could produce, echoes that seemed to answer his singing with phrases that came from no visible source. Emily Johnson maintained their intelligence network despite physical isolation, studying papers taken from Vincent Blackwood's saddlebags and reconstructing the pursuit's organization from correspondence and expense records. She learned that their capture had been coordinated across 6 states, involving telegraph communications, financial arrangements, and legal mechanisms that commanded resources far exceeding the monetary value of 9 enslaved people. The pursuit's scale revealed what Vincent Blackwood had stated explicitly. This had never been about simple property recovery, but about ideological warfare, demonstrations that enslaved people who fled would be hunted regardless of cost because allowing successful escapes threatened the entire system's stability. Olivia Smith monitored the group's physical and psychological health with increasing concern. The isolation and uncertainty were taking tolls that manifested in ways ranging from insomnia to irritability to periods of withdrawn silence. She recognized symptoms of depression and anxiety, conditions that her healing knowledge could treat only partially since the root causes stemmed from circumstances beyond botanical remedies. Reach. Most concerning was the growing discussion about spring contingencies and what they should do when supplies ran critically low. The conversation started theoretically, exploring options that ranged from attempting to reach Mormon settlements to surrendering to authorities in exchange for promises of lenient treatment. But as February approached, and food supplies dwindled faster than calculations predicted, the discussions took on urgency that transformed philosophy into immediate survival calculus. William Brown called a council during the first week of February, gathering the Exodus 9 in the main chamber where firelight created dancing shadows against carved walls. His expression carried weight that transcended simple leadership responsibility, suggesting that he'd reached conclusions no one wanted to hear, but everyone needed to confront. "We're facing choices that will define who we are and whether we survive," William began without preamble. "Our supplies will last 3 more weeks, maybe 4, if we cut rations further. Spring won't come for at least 6 weeks after that, probably 8, given the snow accumulation outside. That leaves a gap of 4 to 6 weeks where we'll have no food." The mathematics were undeniable, and Alexander Davis nodded confirmation of the calculations. The others sat in silence that pressed as heavily as the stone ceiling, waiting for William to articulate what everyone had already contemplated in private thoughts they'd been reluctant to speak aloud. "We have options," William continued carefully. "We can try to leave now, attempt to reach settlements before supplies run completely out. That means traveling through winter conditions that will likely kill us before we reach help. We can send a small party for supplies while the rest wait here, but that risks both groups and doesn't guarantee success. Or we can consider alternatives that I'm reluctant to even mention, but that circumstances might eventually require." The unspoken option hung in air that suddenly felt thinner, colder, despite the chamber's constant temperature. No one wanted to name what William meant, but everyone understood the implications of his careful phrasing and the reason he'd called this council to address what individual conscience couldn't resolve alone. The first weeks of February passed with the relentless precision of a clock that counted down toward inevitability. The Exodus 9 awoke each morning to the same stone walls, the same echoing chambers, the same firelight that cast the same weary shadows across faces, hollowed by hunger and sleeplessness. What had once been a sanctuary now felt like a tomb, its carved walls mocking them with astronomical symbols that measured time in cycles far longer than human lifespans. The heavens would continue their eternal dance long after flesh failed and bones decayed. Rations had already been cut twice. What once stretched across a day now had to sustain for 2. Meals consisted of thin broth from boiled roots, or the brittle remains of dried meat taken from Blackwood's hunting party. Each portion grew smaller, each mouthful more bitter for being shared under the weight of unspoken knowledge. The children of hunger walked among them now, whispering into ears and tugging at limbs with invisible fingers. William Brown carried himself with unshakable dignity, but his eyes betrayed the erosion of certainty. He had led men and women across impossible terrain, outwitted armed hunters, and stood in defiance of men who believed themselves gods. Yet in the face of starvation, leadership became a matter not of courage, but of arithmetic. Every day he performed silent calculations with Alexander Davis, and every night the answers became more grim. Alexander's notes covered a slate taken from the captives, supplies, filled with numbers that marched downward like soldiers retreating from a lost battle. He counted the days remaining before their food vanished entirely, factoring in what little Logan Robinson could snare from the blind fish or subterranean mammals. Even with miraculous hunting, the shortfall remained insurmountable. "We will break before March ends," he admitted one night, his voice stripped of pretense. "Unless conditions outside change, we are cornered between famine and madness." Madness was already showing its teeth. Jonathan Walker's singing, once a balm, had grown erratic. His songs no longer carried rhythms of resistance or coded hope. They had become fragments, dissonant notes stretched into unnatural tones. At times, his voice seemed answered by echoes that twisted into words none could fully recognize but all instinctively feared. Joshua Martin swore he had heard his grandmother's voice among those echoes, whispering warnings from beyond the grave. Olivia Smith insisted it was nothing but auditory illusion, yet even she admitted her scalp prickled whenever Jonathan sang in the deep chambers. The fungi Joshua studied continued their inexplicable growth. Pale strands thickened across walls overnight, forming patterns that mirrored the astronomical carvings above. Bioluminescent caps pulsed faintly in rhythms that matched heartbeats, as though the cave itself had become a living organism breathing around them. The edible varieties they harvested tasted more bitter with each passing week, as if sustenance carried the price of creeping corruption. Joshua warned against eating the luminous specimens, though more than one pair of eyes had lingered on them with thoughts unspoken. Tensions rose like floodwaters. Samuel Thompson and Andrew Harris nearly came to blows over whether to continue exploring the deeper sealed passages. Samuel argued that answers and possibly salvation lay beyond, while Andrew warned that opening sealed chambers risked unleashing whatever had killed the former inhabitants. Their shouts reverberated off stone until William intervened, silencing both men with a single look that conveyed more authority than words could. Yet even William knew such fractures could not be mended with silence forever. Then came the first death. It was not one of the 9 but a horse, weakened by limited forage and the unrelenting conditions of subterranean life. Emily Johnson found the animal collapsed in one of the side caverns, breath shallow, eyes dulled with resignation. She called Olivia, who confirmed what all already knew. The horse would not rise again. They could not spare food to nurse it, nor strength to bury it. Its life ended quietly, Samuel's blade ensuring swiftness where starvation offered only cruelty. The body lay there for hours, heavy and undeniable. Hunger's whispers grew louder. Joshua suggested stripping the hide for leather and rendering fat for candles, practical uses that avoided darker implications. Yet no one spoke aloud the other thought, the one that pulsed in every hollow stomach. That night William called another council. Firelight painted his face in harsh relief, carving lines deeper than his years. The others sat in a half-circle, shadows crowding closer as though eager participants in the council's debate. "We must speak plainly," William began. "Our food is nearly gone. We will not reach spring with the supplies remaining. Today the horse died, and we all know what that means." Olivia flinched as though struck. "If you suggest—" "I suggest nothing yet," William interrupted firmly. "I only name the truth. There will come a day when hunger demands choices no one here wishes to face. We must decide now, together, how we will meet that moment. Will we cling to principles even if it means perishing, or will we allow necessity to strip us of principles in order to live?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "Principles mean nothing to corpses. I say we do what is required. Better to live stained than die pure." Olivia's eyes flashed. "You would have us become the very monsters they claim us to be. If we take that step, we prove Blackwood right. We prove every lie about our nature." Alexander folded his hands calmly. "This is not philosophy but mathematics. A horse provides enough sustenance to extend our survival weeks beyond our current rations. To ignore that is to embrace death voluntarily. Philosophy means nothing in the grave." Jonathan's voice broke the tense silence, soft and strange. "I heard them sing," he murmured, eyes unfocused. "The ones buried deep, their bones still sing in the stone. They did this before, I think. They chose the same path, and the canyon remembers. It wants us to repeat." Unease rippled through the group. Joshua shivered visibly. "My grandmother warned that places hold memory. If this cave remembers blood, then blood will find us again. Emily Johnson pressed her hands together. We cannot allow fear of curses to blind us to survival, yet nor can we dismiss the weight of what we would become. If we cross this threshold, there is no return. William let the arguments play themselves out before speaking again. His voice carried the heavy authority of command, softened by sorrow. If we must take this step, then we do it with dignity. We do it together, and we do not allow it to divide us. This is not about proving Blackwood right or wrong. This is about surviving long enough that our freedom is not wasted in these stones. The decision was not unanimous, but it was binding. They would not waste the horse. Samuel and Logan took the grim task upon themselves. They worked in silence, blades cutting through hide and sinew, steam rising in the cold air. The smell filled the cavern, sharp and metallic, mingling with smoke from the fire until the air grew nearly unbreathable. Olivia tended to the meat with a healer's precision, her hands steady though her heart rebelled. Jonathan sang softly as they worked, a song without words that sounded too much like mourning to bring comfort. When the meal was ready, they gathered in silence. No one spoke as the first pieces were passed, each accepting with hands that trembled from more than hunger. William bowed his head before eating, not in prayer to a god that had long seemed deaf to their cries, but in recognition of the line they had crossed. The meat was tough. Its taste mingled with smoke and ash, but it filled bellies that had long since forgotten satisfaction. Warmth spread through limbs, strength returned to muscles, and for the first time in weeks, exhaustion did not overwhelm completely. Yet the price clung to them like smoke, invisible but suffocating. That night none slept easily. Dreams twisted into grotesque visions, horses screaming in human voices, mushrooms pulsing with heartbeats, Blackwood's mocking laughter echoing through the cavern. Joshua woke with a cry, swearing he'd seen the carved symbols on the walls glowing faintly in rhythm with his pulse. Days passed. The horse's body sustained them longer than rations alone could have. Yet hunger soon returned, sharper than before for having tasted relief. The whispers in the stone grew louder, voices bleeding from echo into language. Jonathan was not the only one hearing them now. Logan confessed he'd heard his mother calling his name from the deeper tunnels. Emily admitted to hearing children's laughter in the darkness, though no children lived among them. And then, as if the canyon conspired to sharpen their torment, another horse fell. By then, the choice came faster. The arguments repeated, but with less conviction, the resistance weaker. The second horse fed them, and the taste was easier to swallow. Jonathan sang again, his melodies darker, the echoes answering more clearly. William watched all of this with a leader's despair. He had sworn they would not become the monsters their enemies imagined. Yet each step down this path felt less like choice, and more like inevitability. He wondered if the canyon had been built as a refuge or a trap, not for bodies but for souls. On the final night of February, a storm howled across the mountains above, snow and wind battering the peaks unseen by those below. In the main chamber, the Exodus 9 gathered around their dwindling fire. Hunger's shadow loomed once more, heavier with each passing day. William spoke into the silence. We have lasted through February. Spring is still weeks away. We have no more horses to spare. If conditions do not change, we will face the choice again. And this time, it will not be beasts of burden that lie before us. The fire popped, throwing sparks upward like fleeting stars. The silence that followed was more suffocating than any storm because all knew exactly what William meant. The canyon waited, listening, as 9 free souls sat together on the edge of a darkness no mathematics could calculate, no philosophy could redeem. March came to Whisper Canyon without spring's promise. Snowstorms above still buried the mountains, sealing the 9 within stone passages where time lost its rhythm. Days and nights blurred, measured only by the cycle of firewood dwindling and meals shrinking. The horse meat was gone now. Hunger stalked them openly, no longer a whisper but a constant gnawing presence. The council no longer debated whether they would eat. That decision had been made. The question now was who. It began with sickness. Joshua Martin discovered that some of the fungi they had relied upon for sustenance were turning against them. Their textures grew rubbery, their bioluminescence brighter. Olivia confirmed his suspicion after examining several who had eaten too much. Their stomachs cramped, their bowels emptied violently, their skin grew clammy. The safe mushrooms had become poison, or perhaps the cave had simply decided to withdraw its mercy. "We are being forced," Joshua muttered one night as he examined a glowing cluster that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. "The canyon won't let us leave on our own terms. It is shaping us, choosing our steps before we take them." The group tried not to answer, but everyone felt the truth of it. 2 nights later, Logan Robinson returned from a scouting trip deeper into the caverns. His face was pale, his eyes wild. He swore he had seen figures in the dark, shapes that moved just beyond torchlight. "Not echoes, not shadows," he insisted when the others pressed him. "Men, women, but not alive. They watched me, standing where the fungi glow brightest. They whispered names, our names." Jonathan Walker confirmed Logan's vision without hesitation. His songs had grown more disturbing each day, filled with half-formed words that seemed borrowed from another language. That night he sang softly, and the echoes returned not in harmony but in voices. Clear, distinct, multiple. Some carried tones of weeping, others of command, others of hunger. Williams silenced him, but the silence could not undo what all had heard. By the second week of March, desperation reached its peak. Andrew Harris collapsed while mapping one of the upper tunnels, his body too weak to continue. Olivia examined him and spoke the words none wanted to hear. "If he continues to weaken, he won't last another week." The council convened that night, though by now it was no longer a council but a tribunal. Faces gaunt, eyes hollow, they sat around the fire as it burned low. William began as he always did, voice steady, carrying the weight of leadership even as his soul faltered. "We stand where no choice is clean," he said. "The horses are gone. The food is gone. The mushrooms betray us. Andrew is failing. If one falls, the rest may survive longer. If we deny that choice, we all perish. The canyon has cornered us." Olivia wept openly. "I cannot sanction murder," she cried. "I cannot. If Andrew dies of sickness, then so be it. But to choose who lives and who dies, that is a cruelty I cannot carry." Samuel's voice was sharp with anger. "Cruelty is letting 9 people die when one death could save 8. You call it murder, I call it arithmetic. You think Blackwood and his kind will care whether we clung to principle when our bones are all that's left?" Emily Johnson, always the pragmatic voice, added softly, "If we do nothing, Andrew's death will be slow, painful. If we use it, his passing could sustain us. He would not die for nothing." Jonathan lifted his head, eyes shining strangely in the firelight. "The canyon already chose. It wants his blood. It sings his name." The silence after his words was worse than shouting. Andrew himself broke it. Propped against the wall, his voice rasped with weakness, but carried clarity no one expected. "If my death feeds you, then I do not die in vain. I will not be taken back to chains. I will not freeze in the snow. If this is the price of freedom, then I pay it willingly. But promise me it ends with me. Do not let the canyon take more." Olivia screamed at him, begged him to be silent, but he only smiled faintly. His eyes sought William's, and William, leader, protector, builder, felt his heart break. Yet he nodded. That night, they did what no free people should ever have to do. Samuel carried out the act swiftly, blade flashing in the dim firelight. Olivia tended to Andrew's body afterward, tears falling onto skin that had once been warm with life. She did not eat. She could not. But the others did. Hunger drowned sorrow, and the taste, though bitter, filled their veins with strength. Jonathan sang as they ate, his voice carrying low, mournful notes that echoed back with eerie harmony. The cave itself seemed to listen, and the glowing fungi brightened as if in recognition. The following days blurred. Strength returned to bodies that had been wasting away, but it came at the price of silence and shame. No one spoke of Andrew. His absence hung heavier than his presence ever had. Olivia avoided the group entirely, tending the fire alone, speaking only when forced. Samuel grew harder, his words clipped and cold. William felt every glance heavy with accusation, even when none were spoken. But worse than guilt was the change in the canyon. The symbols on the walls no longer seemed static. Alexander swore he saw them shift when the fire burned low, lines curving into shapes that matched constellations he had tracked. Joshua's mushrooms pulsed brighter each night, spreading faster as if nourished by the act of blood. And Jonathan's songs grew stronger, his echoes answering in phrases more distinct, words half recognizable. On the 17th night of March, Logan woke the camp with screams. He had dreamt of Andrew, standing in the burial chamber, eyes hollow, lips whispering, "One is never enough." The group gathered in terror, listening to Logan stammer through the vision. No one dismissed it. They could not. Because deep down, each of them felt the truth of it already. Hunger was returning. And the canyon was waiting. William stood apart from the others, staring into the darkness of the passages. He thought of Blackwood's words, of freedom requiring more than running. He thought of the men who had built these caverns before them, men who had left their dead sealed in stone. He thought of Andrew's plea, that it end with him. But William knew, with the cold certainty of a leader damned by responsibility, that Andrew's sacrifice would not be the last. The canyon had claimed them the moment they stepped into its shadows. And somewhere, deep within stone that had outlived empires, voices whispered in unison. They did not say names this time. They said only one word, again and again, echoing until it filled every chamber. The 17th night of March broke something in the Exodus 9. Logan's dream of Andrew whispering, "One is never enough," hung over them like a pall, and no matter how fiercely Olivia denounced it as nothing more than grief's trick, no one fully believed her. The others moved through the following days with haunted silence, avoiding each other's eyes, carrying their guilt like stones strapped to their backs. Yet hunger was crueler than guilt. By the third day after Logan's vision, the sustenance Andrew's body had given them began to fade. Muscles grew heavy again, breaths shortened, and the fire of survival guttered low in their veins. Each time the firewood snapped in the hearth, it sounded like bones breaking, a reminder of what they had done and what they might yet do again. The cave itself seemed complicit. The fungi Joshua studied spread across the walls faster than nature allowed. Thin threads of white thickened into veins, connecting chamber to chamber until the cavern resembled the inside of some enormous living creature. The bioluminescent caps pulsed brighter at night, their rhythm no longer random but synchronized like a heartbeat. When Jonathan sang, the mushrooms glowed in tandem with his voice, and the echoes that answered him carried words that were now clear enough for all to hear. More, more, more. William began to fear sleep. Each night he dreamed of the canyon's builders, the long-dead tribe whose bones lay sealed in alcoves. In his dreams, their eyes opened in unison, white orbs staring through centuries, accusing him without words. Yet mixed with their accusation was something darker, an invitation. Alexander recorded everything obsessively, his slate filled with calculations, charts, and sketches of the shifting wall symbols. He insisted the star patterns were changing, aligning into constellations that did not belong to any sky they had ever known. "It's as though the canyon charts its own heavens," he whispered one night, showing William the crude drawings. "And the more we feed, the more the patterns evolve. It is not just hunger at work here. It is design." William wanted to call it madness, yet when he looked at the walls himself, he too thought he saw motion in the carvings. The group fractured under the weight of fear. Olivia isolated herself, tending to fire and water but refusing to eat further. Her eyes grew hollow, her frame skeletal, but her spirit remained unyielding. "I will not partake again," she declared when Samuel pressed her. "Andrew's sacrifice was tragedy enough. I will not add sin to sorrow." Samuel, hardened now beyond empathy, sneered at her refusal. "Principles won't fill your stomach, Olivia. When you collapse like Andrew, do you think the rest of us will bury you out of respect, or will you be the next to keep us alive?" Emily rebuked him, though her voice wavered. "Do not speak so. She has the right to choose her fate. We all do." "Choice is an illusion," Samuel replied coldly. "The canyon has already chosen for us." Jonathan no longer needed to be coaxed into song. He sang constantly, melodies winding through the chambers like threads binding them all to something unseen. The words that returned in echoes were not always English. Some were fragments of languages none of them recognized, syllables harsh and guttural, others smooth and melodic, as if ancient tongues awoke in the stone. Jonathan swore he understood them, though his translations changed each time he spoke. "It says Andrew walks among us still," he murmured one night, eyes glassy. "It says the line has only just begun. It says one body feeds 9, but 9 bodies feed eternity." Joshua begged him to stop singing, claiming the mushrooms reacted dangerously to his voice, swelling and spreading further. But Jonathan only smiled. "The canyon sings through me. I am only the vessel." The breaking point came on the 21st day of March. Logan Robinson and Samuel Thompson ventured into one of the deeper tunnels in search of water. Hours passed without their return. When they finally stumbled back into the main chamber, Logan carried no buckets, only blood on his hands. His face was pale, his expression hollow. Samuel followed behind him, limping, his arm torn by a jagged wound. Olivia rushed forward, but Samuel shoved her aside, his fury erupting. "He tried to kill me," Samuel roared, pointing a shaking hand at Logan. "He pushed me into the rocks. He wanted me gone. He wanted me dead so there'd be more food for the rest." Logan shook his head violently. No, it was not me. It was him. He attacked me first. He said I was weak, that I'd slow us down. I fought him off, but I swear it wasn't me who struck first." Their voices rose, accusations clashing like steel. The others surrounded them, William stepping between to prevent blood from being spilled there and then. But the damage was done. Suspicion, once dormant, had awoken fully. For the first time, it was not hunger alone but fear of each other that threatened to destroy them. That night, William tried to keep watch, but exhaustion pulled him into uneasy sleep. He woke to screams. Olivia's voice echoed through the cavern, shrill with terror. When William staggered to his feet, he saw her kneeling beside Logan's body. His throat was cut, blood soaking into the fungal threads that eagerly drank it up. Samuel stood nearby, knife in hand, his face twisted into a mask of justification. "He would have killed us all," Samuel spat. He admitted it. He confessed in his sleep. This was mercy, for him and for us. Olivia sobbed, clutching Logan's lifeless hand. "You murdered him. You damned us all." Jonathan began to sing again, louder, more frenzied, his voice weaving with the echoes until the very stones seemed to vibrate. The word came back to them, again and again, louder with each repetition. More, more, more. Samuel turned toward the group, eyes blazing with a fervor that chilled William to his core. "We cannot waste him. We cannot. If we do not use what has been given, then Logan dies for nothing. You all know it." Emily retched in the corner. Joshua collapsed to his knees, muttering prayers. Olivia screamed until her voice broke, yet even she could not deny the gnawing in her stomach, the sharp clawing hunger that tore at her insides. William closed his eyes. For a moment he thought of Blackwood, of the plantations, of chains and whips. He thought of how far they had come, of the freedom they had bled for. He thought of Andrew's final words, begging that it end with him. And he knew, with a bitterness deeper than despair, that it would not. That night, Logan Robinson fed the Exodus 9. The meal broke them further. Samuel ate first, tearing into flesh without hesitation, his justification carried on a tide of hunger. Jonathan followed, chanting between bites, his face alight with feverish ecstasy. Emily wept as she ate, whispering apologies to Logan's memory. Joshua forced the food down with trembling hands, nausea battling necessity. Alexander recorded none of it, his slate lying forgotten as he chewed with hollow resignation. Only Olivia refused, her body shaking violently as she watched. Her silence was heavier than words. William ate last. Each mouthful was ash, each swallow a betrayal, yet he forced himself to continue. Leadership demanded it. To refuse would be to fracture the group beyond repair, to admit that they had become less than human. He chewed slowly, the taste clinging to his tongue like sin, and knew he would carry it to his grave. Afterward, the cavern grew unbearably still. The fire flickered low, casting the 9, now 8, in shadows that stretched monstrously across the walls. Jonathan's song trailed into whispers, the echoes continuing long after his voice fell silent. The mushrooms pulsed brighter, spreading across Logan's bloodstain until the stone seemed alive with hunger. Sleep came fitfully. William dreamt of Andrew and Logan standing side by side, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving in unison. They whispered not to him, but to the canyon itself, their words swallowed by the stone as though feeding it. Behind them stood countless others, faces he did not recognize but knew belonged to the builders of this place. All were waiting, all were hungry. When he woke, William found Olivia gone. Her bedroll lay abandoned, her few possessions scattered. Panic swept through the group as they searched, but there was no trace of her in the tunnels. Only a smear of blood on the stone near one of the sealed passages, and the faint glow of mushrooms spreading across it like veins. Samuel declared she had fled, choosing starvation over survival. Joshua feared worse, that the canyon had claimed her directly. Jonathan only smiled, humming softly as if he already knew the answer. The Exodus 9 had become 7, and the canyon still whispered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.